Everyone, welcome to a video I've been wanting to make for a really long time. Also, don't mind the sunglasses. I decided that I'm sick of trying to keep my eyes on focus during these recordings, and also I thought they looked nice and cheesy, so why not? So today I am talking about a game that I've been wanting to talk about for a very long time, actually predating my time playing shmups and being interested in shmups. I was a fan of Ninja Gaiden 2. I feel like this game is absolutely a misunderstood masterpiece, or whatever you could say, underrated masterpiece, I guess you could say. I would call it probably my favorite 3D video game in general. I think the only other contender is Resident Evil 4. I kind of go back and forth between those two on which is my favorite. But nevertheless, it is a top tier game in my opinion. I feel like it has been very unfairly treated by the critical community and by the overall gaming community. So I wanted to talk about Ninja Gaiden 2 and why it is such an amazing masterpiece that more people definitely need to get into. Whenever I talk to people about this game, it's either that they are in the know and they know it's awesome and badass, or they hardly know about it at all, really. I think it got kind of passed over, and I really feel like a lot of it was the way the gaming press treated the game on release. Because up to the point it came out, there was a shitload of hype for this game. There was a ton. So I'm sure you all are probably familiar with the Ninja Gaiden reboot series, I guess you could say, the 3D action series rather than the 2D platforming series. And the title in this series that is by far the most praised, the most loved, is the original for the Xbox, or the black variant for the Xbox, Ninja Gaiden Black. And while I definitely agree that those are amazing and awesome games, I feel like they are a little bit overrated compared to the sequel, Ninja Gaiden 2, and the sequel is absolutely underrated. So whenever you hear criticisms for Ninja Gaiden 2, there are really two main ways people look at this game. They feel like it's a step back in level design or whatever, because the levels in Ninja Gaiden 2 are linear. They're not these, Legend of Zelda, Ocarina of Time style dungeons and stuff like was in Ninja Gaiden. And then the other criticism is the hardware performance, which is definitely true, especially on Xbox 360. The Xbox One X re-release I think helped that quite a bit, but the original Xbox 360 release does suffer from some hardware slowdown issues. But as a shmup player, I guess I'm a little more forgiving of that than most. So if that's really the big deal breaker for you, if you feel like you can't have a game run and have slowdown at all, then yeah, I guess that's a valid criticism. But I feel like if people started to look past that a little bit more, they'd find that this game does a lot to improve on what the original set out to do, and I think really brought the focus in on what's important, which is the combat system and mechanics. So like I said, the original Ninja Gaiden is really well liked because it kind of has a Dark Souls, Legend of Zelda style gameplay where, yes, there's tons of combat and stuff, but you're also doing quite a bit of exploration and puzzle solving and all those sorts of things. Whereas in Ninja Gaiden 2, no, we're just focusing straight up on combat most of the time. There are some slight puzzle solving, platforming elements, but almost the entire game is all about the combat. But when you start to accept that, okay, is Ninja Gaiden, the reboot series, is this like an action platformer game? Or is this a 3D action game? Like, what genre does this series really belong in? I would say that it's definitely belongs in the latter, 3D action, because like something more aligned with Devil May Cry than with The Legend of Zelda. And I think that's where a lot of the criticisms I think are unfair, because they are kind of blaming it for switching up its genre a little bit more without really exploring, was that switch worth it, or were the trade-offs. A really good example is whenever you hear people talk about Ninja Gaiden, the original for the Xbox, or Ninja Gaiden Black, what is the aspect of that game they always praise and they always say is top notch? The graphics, of course, and Ninja Gaiden 2's graphics are absurdly good for an Xbox 360, so it held up there. And then the combat. Those are the two things. I've never heard someone say, you remember those platforming sections in Ninja Gaiden Black? Those were just amazing. Like, that's what I like in my Ninja Gaiden game, is the platforming. Or, those slight puzzle elements in Ninja Gaiden, or hell forbid, the underwater swimming section. Like, that's really what a Ninja Gaiden game is. No one ever says that. Everyone talks about the combat. But when you compare the combat between Ninja Gaiden 1 to the combat in Ninja Gaiden 2, it's a whole different league. It's a major step up in that realm. Ninja Gaiden 2 has, as I will get into more here, much deeper, much more exciting and interesting combat than Ninja Gaiden 1. 1 was really innovative and does have awesome combat, but it's just like the stepping stone to what Ninja Gaiden 2 has to offer. And I know people who are fans, like hardcore fans of the series, tend to view 1 and 2 as about equal, and I could say that's fair, but I also know that there are people who do choose 2 over 1 because of just the insane amount of combat options. So let's talk about what the differences are, right? Because I've spent more hours playing Ninja Gaiden 1 and 2 than I think like 90% of the gaming population. I've master cleared both of them, played them for probably hundreds of hours at this point, so I know both very well. And I think the main difference with 1 is that the system is a little more basic. So 2 has this really awesome kill system called the dismemberment system. And I think for anyone who hasn't played Ninja Gaiden 2, you will find a very similar system that I think was inspired by it, which is in the latest Doom 2016, when you do your glory kills. I feel like that glory kill system is almost a verbatim copy of the dismemberment system in Ninja Gaiden 2, where if you take off a limb of a character, like you will see many times, like I'm about to do here, and then you do your heavy attack, you'll do a glory kill, I guess you could say, right? That's a good way of describing it, on them. And that actually adds a lot more depth into the combat than you would think, because you can target specific limbs, and certain attacks have more likelihood to dismember than other attacks. Like, for instance, if you're unsheathing your sword, like the first strike from unsheathing usually has a greater chance, I've found, of dismembering a limb than, if you're just in mid-combo. So it's interesting how you can kind of calculate where and how you attack to get those different limbs. And depending on the enemy types, that may or may not be the valid way to approach the fight. And then also, whenever you're doing a dismemberment kill, you get a little bit of invincibility, like you get right there. And so that's the main way you can handle enemies grouping up on you like this. So what's really interesting about Ninja Gaiden compared to most other action games, I would say even Bayonetta and Devil May Cry to a smaller extent, is that the enemy onslaught is not held back by any means. So when enemies gang up on you, they will all simultaneously attack you. They don't take turns, or the enemy isn't stifled in that way. So the combat can be extremely, extremely challenging and difficult, especially if you don't know the deeper systems and mechanics, because you can just get mauled by groups of enemies very quickly. And you don't have any kind of... There are some cheap things you can kind of do to get out of it, but in the higher difficulties especially, those start to erode very quickly, and so the game really forces you to engage with the combat in a much more hands-on way than I think even Ninja Gaiden 1, to be honest. Ninja Gaiden 1 had some difficult combat sections, but nothing like Ninja Gaiden 2. And then there were sections in Ninja Gaiden 1, like in the sewers, where you just spam charge attacks against your enemies. And so there, I got a Master Ninja clear. So the clips you're watching are just like highlights, rather than just showing you straight through gameplay of the level. I cut out a lot of the run from point A to point B stuff, so you're really just watching 20 solid minutes of me killing enemies in the first two stages. So anyway, the combat system in Ninja Gaiden 2 is a major step up from Ninja Gaiden 1, and also the weapon variety. So especially if you play the Sigma port, so there are different versions of Ninja Gaiden 2. It's a complicated game. That's why I think it's not flawless for a lot of reasons. There are flaws, and then there are different releases that address some of the flaws, but then introduce others. So for instance, the big flaw with the 360 port, depending on who you are, I wouldn't say the difficulty of the 360 port is a flaw, but it is definitely a barrier of entry to newer players of the series. I feel like Ninja Gaiden 2 is definitely, it can be your first introduction to the series, but I think the Sigma port of Ninja Gaiden 2 is a little bit kinder and kind of maybe an easier way to get into the combat than just straight up the 360 port, because the 360 port has more enemies, they're more aggressive, it has more slowdown, and the projectile enemies especially are brutal and ruthless and spammy and obnoxious. So you have to really know how to handle them beforehand, otherwise you're not going to have a good time. And so when you look at the initial release for this game, the release reviews were pretty mediocre to bad, and I think it even won some kind of, award for least improved sequel. So it didn't get the best attention at that time when it first came out. And I think the main reasons for that was because I think a really good analog to this is, if you guys are aware of the actual Super Mario Bros. 2, which is Super Mario Bros. 2 The Lost Levels. That's the one where it's just way harder than Super Mario Bros. 1, and it has some elements that a lot of people felt were cheap and kind of cruel. And that's kind of what a really good example of what Ninja Gaiden 2 is that if you're coming into Ninja Gaiden 2 as just some reviewer and you didn't hone your ability and combat skills in Ninja Gaiden 1, which I think was the idea of the game. And also, I think the guy who created Ninja Gaiden 2, there's actually a really good documentary about the creation of this game on G4 back in the day. I mean, obviously it's a little cheesy, but it kind of gives you an insight onto what the idea behind this game was. And the idea was just uncompromised difficulty and depth, and you know what I mean. There were no compromises to accessibility with Ninja Gaiden 2. That was not going to happen. It's all about just taking things way higher to the next level. And so even on normal difficulty, you're going to get whipped if you're new to the series. You're going to get owned, because I'm playing on warrior difficulty, which is sort of, I would consider, normal difficulty. It's the hard mode of Ninja Gaiden Sigma, and then the normal mode of the 360 port, and then, or 360 version, and then the Acolyte is like the easy mode. And this is one of the few games where if you haven't played it and you get the 360 port, play Acolyte, play easy mode first, so that you can kind of learn what you're doing, because this game has a lot of advanced techniques that I should point out as we continue on here. For instance, counters are huge. So when you're blocking, if you hit attack X or Y, whichever one you want to do, a heavy counter or light counter, you have to time it really precisely to when they're striking your blade. And if you hit the window, you will do a counter, and usually that'll get a dismembered limb, and then you can kill them. And also, too, you have to learn the movements of the different enemies and their attack patterns, because they're very nuanced and not predictable at all. Like, you can kind of get a sense for what they will do, but it's not like, in beat-em-ups where it's 1, 2, 3, flowchart. Like, there was a really good counter. The thing about counter, though, is there's a risk reward. If you miss your counter, you'll drop your guard and get hit out of it. So you have to be really precise, especially as you get more and more enemies on top of you. And there's also another feature that a lot of people don't know, but holding guard will buffer your guard, and that's really good. So whenever you're fighting, pretty much always hold guard, like after you, except when you attack. So like when you go to strike or whatever you're doing, immediately after you strike, hold guard. And so you're holding guard a lot, and that will buffer your guard even though the animation isn't open. And so I think that's lesson 1 for Ninja Gaiden players to learn, is after every strike, hold guard, because you'll buffer it, and it'll usually come out, well, it will come out before the actual animation of him holding his sword up comes out. So always be doing that. And then when you're guarding, there's a, I don't know the exact term for it. I'm sure the Ninja Gaiden expert players will have a term for it, but I call it a run counter or dash counter. So when you're guarding, like I said, if you hit X and Y, you'll do an attack counter. But a safer version of that, which you'll see I'll do on bosses all the time, is you just dash out of it, and you get like this little counter animation, and you can get a much quicker, you can kind of cancel the block stun of the dash. Here, I'll show you right now. I do it a ton on this guy. So whenever you're blocking against like bosses or groups of enemies, the dash counter is critical. There, I did it just then. There, see, that's what it is. Anyway, so the game has all these, a lot of these are in Ninja Gaiden 1 as well, but it has all these different techniques and in-depth mechanics that makes the combat system, I wouldn't say unparalleled, because I'm not a master player in Devil May Cry, and I know that one's really complex and deep too, so I don't want to say it's deeper than Devil May Cry, but I feel like those two, Ninja Gaiden and Devil May Cry, are definitely the strongest and the deepest. And so yeah, when you get really good at this game, like I would consider myself pretty damn good at this game, and look at me, I'm still getting hit. I mean, the depth is just that, but it is possible to just go through the entire stage without getting hit. It's definitely possible, but just the level of execution is that high. So some other things about Ninja Gaiden 2 that I definitely want to talk about is the game has a ton of content and enemy variety that I would say, again, is just a step up from Ninja Gaiden 1. So you've got more enemy subtypes, and then the enemies themselves have more complex attack patterns. Then there's the whole dismemberment system, which adds another element to the fights. And then the way the enemies are laid out in the stages is usually pretty good. The only places I think that aren't very good is the jungle. I think the jungle stage is just bad. It's just a bad stage, because they just fill it with a bunch of projectile spamming enemies, and then water. It's an awful stage, and then the boss is awful. I think that's definitely the worst stage in the game, but minus the jungle, I think the level design in this game is really good. And yeah, so there's the complexity of the weapon system, the weapon types, and then the weapon upgrading. You can do that in Ninja Gaiden 1 as well, but just to reiterate, the more you upgrade your weapon, not only does it increase the attack properties and damage and everything, but it also gives you access to more and more combos and sub-combos, and you can get really swag with, fully upgraded weapons on all the different attacks you can do. And it's actually meaningful, because it's not just for style, because certain attacks work really well against certain enemies and what you're wanting to do, certain combos. For instance, against these teleporting guys, or the guys with the claws who jump backwards, you want strings that have a bunch of just smaller hits in them, so you can just catch them during their vulnerable parts when they dash or teleport. Whereas with the regular enemies, a harder hitting shorter string is fine, so that you can just get, dismember them quickly and get to the next fight. So much to say about this game, but I just wanted to put this video out there because I feel like it's just, especially lately, I watched the DF Retro review of the game, and I felt like, again, it's just talking about, oh, the game is okay, but it's not that great because of the performance issues. And so, on the topic of the performance issues, there are definitely some hilariously slow sections in the game where it's beyond bullet time. But also, there is a little bit of charm to that in certain sections. Like, there's a famous part. I had to start a new file on my 360, that's why you get the first two stages. There's a part, though, in the final stage where you go up this staircase, and I think in the pre-patched version, so there's two versions, one with a patch and without a patch. In the pre-patched version, I don't know how many enemies come down that staircase, but I would bet about 100. Just an absurd amount of enemies come down this giant staircase, and you have to fight your way up it. And the slowdown is so hilariously slow. It's like 5 frames a second, 10 frames a second, or something. It's really, really slow, but it's also sort of epic because you're like slowly fighting hundreds and hundreds of enemies up this giant staircase. And I think it was really improved on the Xbox X, not Xbox One, but the Xbox One X version. I think the slowdown was pretty markedly improved. The only issue with it was Iconoclast was reporting that there was some kind of weird, if not input lag, maybe some weird problems with the controller. He was having a lot of struggles with it. But I think he was just playing on the Xbox One version, not the Xbox One X. So that's still up in the air, and maybe when the new Xbox comes out, it can deliver even more. That's kind of what I'm looking forward to, is if the Xbox One X can play this game, remove the slowdown, and add FreeSync, we are sitting on something really remarkable right there. And so I just wanted to put this video out there. If you haven't played Ninja Gaiden, please give it a try. Ninja Gaiden 2, or the series. Don't just read the reviews that say, oh, 2 sucks because it's too hard and cheap, and 1's better because it has Zelda puzzles. I would say 1 is definitely an amazing game, but I wouldn't put it in a tier above 2. I'd say they're equals, or 2 is a little better in my personal opinion. And to end this off, just for people who don't know the series that well, there is a 3rd game in the series which went south pretty badly. It did some Resi 5, Resi 6 stuff where they the director left, and then the thing about Team Ninja is I think Team Ninja is still really good, and they can make Ninja Gaiden without the original director guy. But Ninja Gaiden 3, they took it in this really weird direction, the vanilla version, where they just dumbed it down. They tried to, Street Fighter 5 it. They tried to simplify it and add quick time. It just was really bad. But then they did a re-release called Ninja Gaiden 3 Razor's Edge, where they basically said, never mind, we're going to try and make this a hardcore Ninja Gaiden game again. And the thing about Razor's Edge is it's got a lot of criticism and been like, well, it's too little too late, it sucks, it's not that good. I would say definitely in comparison to 1 and 2, Razor's Edge is not that great in comparison to them. It's not on their level, but at the same time, it is still a really good action game, and it has like the blood on bone systems, like a cool take on the dismemberment system, and then they brought back dismemberment, so you get both of those. I actually think it's really fun and do play it pretty often. It's just not as well done as 2. But still, I think it's worth checking out. I definitely would not make it your first game in the series, though. I'd say play 1 or 2, depending on what you're looking for. And then if you just can't get enough Ninja Gaiden, play Razor's Edge, because it has a lot of cool stuff. And then also, on the subject of the Sigma releases, I know like the hardcore Ninja Gaiden homies kind of smirk at the idea of Sigma, which is the PS3 release, because what Sigma does is it drops the difficulty down, it drops the enemy count down to kind of, help with the slowdown stuff, and then it removes all the blood and gore for some reason that I'm not quite sure of. I kind of wonder, people say it was a censorship thing, and maybe that is true, but I also kind of wonder if it toned it down to try and remove the slowdown a little bit. I don't know if that has an effect or not, but I'm just wondering with all the blood splattered effects and stuff if that adds to the slowdown even slightly. Well, anyway, Sigma though is a much more streamlined version of the game, in a good way I would say, and it does add like extra stages, extra boss fights and stuff, so I think it's a worthy addition. So I do like Sigma quite a bit. The 360 version is the best and definitive version, but it's like a fun arrange mode. I think that's a good way to think about it. It's like a fun arrange mode of Ninja Gaiden where it kind of tones down the difficulty, adds some really cool new weapons like the Emma's Fang. I love that weapon. And yeah, so if you only have a PS3, don't believe the haters. The Sigma version is worth checking out. And if you have the 360, the 360 version's the definitive version, and if you're a fan of the series, definitely own both and play them both, I would say. So yeah, that's my spiel on Ninja Gaiden 2. I love this game. I play it multiple times per year all the way through. It's one of my favorites. So check it out.